first lived in Latvia as a diplomat between 1996 and 1999, a few years after Latvia regained independence from the crumbling Soviet Union. I returned to live in Latvia in 2022. This podcast series is based on my observations and experience, with some history and comparisons with my home country of England on aspects of life in Latvia and things to see and experience. On the deportations, the trains to Siberia. There's a railway station in Tornakauns, just across the Daugava River from Riga's old town. If you go there today, you'll find an old wooden freight wagon sitting on a short stretch of track. It looks unremarkable, a little battered. Reddish-brown timber, faded and weathered by decades of Baltic winters. But that wagon tells a story Latvia has never been allowed to forget. Today, I want to take you on one of the most difficult and, I think, one of the most important journeys this podcast has made. We're going to talk about the deportations, the two great waves of terror in which the Soviet-Russian regime tore tens of thousands of Latvian men, women and children from their homes and sent them to the far corners of the Soviet Empire in June 1941 and March 1949. These are dates that every Latvian knows by heart, taught and commemorated in schools. Nowadays, we call the deportations a crime against humanity. I want to tell you not only what happened, but how it happened, the machinery of it, and why the Soviets did it. I want to tell you about one extraordinary Latvian woman who survived it all and refused to be broken. And at the end, I'll tell you where in Riga you can go to understand this history for yourself, all from the perspective of an outsider, a foreigner, living in Latvia. Let's begin. The first wave. It is the night of the 13th of June 1941. Latvia has been a Soviet republic for less than a year. In June 1940, the Red Army rolled across the border, and by August that year, the Soviet Union had formally annexed Latvia, a takeover that the major Western powers never recognized as legal. The new Soviet authorities got to work immediately. They dismantled Latvian institutions, arrested political figures, began compiling lists, long, detailed lists of people. Because across Moscow, in the offices of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, a general named Ivan Serov had spent the previous 2 years refining a blueprint for what he called the deportation of anti-Soviet elements. His instructions had originally been prepared for occupied Western Ukraine. By the winter of 1941, they had been adapted for the Baltic states. The plan was bureaucratic in its thoroughness and brutal in its intent. Families with connections to state and local government, the military, civic organisations and trade were all on the lists. Former members of the National Guard, landowners, merchants, school teachers, scouts, anyone who, in the eyes of the Soviet state, had occupied a position of influence in an independent Latvia. They were labelled suspect and anti-Soviet elements, class enemies and bourgeois nationalists. and on the night of the 13th of June 1941 they came for them. NKVD officers and local activists arrived at the doors of targeted families across Latvia, in cities, in towns, and on farmsteads in the countryside. They knocked in the small hours of the morning, when children were still asleep and men were still in bed. People were given less than an hour, some sources say as little as 20 minutes, to gather what they could carry. Everything else, their homes, furniture, livestock and savings, was confiscated by the state. In the early morning darkness, families were herded to assembly points. More than 50 had been prepared across the country. They were then loaded, crammed is the better word, into railway cattle wagons, freight cars designed for animals, wooden walls, no proper sanitation, a hole cut in a corner of the floor served as a toilet. Over 40 people were pushed into each car. Then the doors were bolted shut. But before the trains pulled out from Tornakauns and other stations, something happened that has haunted Latvian memory ever since. The men were separated from their families. Husbands were taken from their wives, fathers from their children. The men, some 8,250 of them, were arrested as enemies of the people and sent to hard labour camps deep within the Soviet Gulag. The women and children, labelled family members of enemies of the people, were taken to so-called administrative settlements and forced into exile in Siberia and Central Asia. Many of those women never knew what had become of their husbands. Soviet-censored newspapers said nothing. The militia provided no information. Families waiting at home in Latvia had no way to find out who had been taken or where. In the days that followed, small handwritten notes, farewell letters thrown from the wagons by the deported were scattered along the railway lines, a last attempt to reach those they loved. Few of them ever arrived. In total, in that single night and the days that followed, approximately 15,000 Latvian residents, among them 2,400 children under the age of 10, were deported without trial, without charge, and without any legal process whatsoever. The trains headed east. Weeks on the rails. Some died on the journey, the elderly, the very young, and those already ill. Those who survived arrived in the Amur, Tomsk and Omsk regions, vast, empty corners of the Soviet Union where winters were ferocious and conditions were designed to break people. Of those 15,000, around 5,000, between 34 and 40%, died in exile on the journey or were executed. International law has since classified the June 1941 deportations as both genocide and a crime against humanity. The second wave. The second occupation of Latvia began in 1944 and 1945 as the Red Army pushed German forces westwards. By 1949, Latvia had been under Soviet rule for 4 years, but the Soviet authorities had a problem. 2 problems, in fact. The first were the Meža-brāļi, the Forest Brothers. They were Latvian men and some women who refused to accept Soviet rule. They retreated into the forests, built hidden bunkers, and waged guerrilla warfare against the occupying forces. At their peak, from 1946 to 1948, there were hundreds of small units fighting across Latvia. They were a constant thorn in the side of Moscow and were quietly supported at great risk by ordinary Latvian families in the countryside. Farmers who left food at the edge of the trees, mothers who smuggled medicine to sons they hadn't seen in years. The second problem was collectivization. Stalin wanted Latvia's independent farms, the proud, centuries-old farmsteads that defined rural Latvian life, transformed into Soviet collective farms, known as kolkhozy. But Latvian farmers were resisting. They were not signing up. They were not handing over their land. And the resistance was stiffening, not weakening. In Moscow, the solution to both problems was identical. On the 29th of January 1949, Stalin signed a decree ordering the permanent deportation of 29,000 families from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, a total of approximately 87,000 people. The operation was given a code name, Priboj. In English it means coastal surf. A breaking wave that would sweep people out of Latvia forever. The preparations took months. Instructions were drawn up in meticulous, terrifying detail. Operational group leaders were briefed on exactly how to approach a family. They were to explain, with a kind of grotesque Soviet bureaucratic courtesy, that the family was being relocated to more distant regions of the Soviet Union. They were told to take note of who offered resistance. At loading stations, commanders were instructed to organise the swift and correct loading of deportees into cattle wagons. More than 76,000 Soviet troops, security personnel and Communist Party activists were mobilised. Local officials and activists considered loyal to the regime were assembled in community centres the night before, told that they were attending a spring sowing meeting and kept there under guard so they couldn't warn the victims. At 1 hour past midnight on the 25th of March 1949, the operation began simultaneously across all 3 Baltic republics. Dawn broke over Latvian farms to the sound of knocking, or sometimes the sound of boots breaking down doors. Families were given time to pack. Some managed to grab blankets, a few clothes, a photograph. Many were loaded onto trucks first, then transferred to freight trains at railway loading points. $8,422 trucks and 66 freight trains. The scale is staggering. This time, entire families were deported together, men, women, the elderly, and small children. But over 70% of the deportees were still women and children under the age of 16. In many cases, the men had already been arrested in earlier sweeps or were out in the forest with the partisans. In 4 days, just 4 days, over 40,000 Latvians were deported, part of a Baltic total exceeding 90,000 people. They were transported to the most inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union, settlements that one historian has described as gulags without barbed wire. They were classified as special settlers, forbidden to leave their designated area and required to report regularly to Soviet authorities. Attempts to escape were punishable by 20 years hard labour. The operation was brutally effective. By the end of 1949, 93% of farms in Latvia had been collectivized. In just 1 year, the mass deportation achieved what years of pressure and propaganda had failed to achieve. The Forest Brothers, stripped of the family support networks on which they depended, began to collapse. The 1949 deportation effectively ended organised armed resistance to Soviet occupation in Latvia. The European Court of Human Rights has since ruled that the March deportation was a crime against humanity. One woman who did not break. Now I want to tell you about one person, because history has a habit of becoming numbers, and numbers don't bleed. I want to make sure that in this episode we remember that behind every statistic there was a life. Lydia Lasmana was born on the 28th of July 1925 in the Almala parish of Aizputja district to a farming family in Kurtzume, Western Latvia. She was raised in a Baptist household, a faith that would, over the decades that followed, become the bedrock of her survival. By the end of the Second World War, Lydia was a young woman training as a nurse in Riga. Kurtzume, where she had grown up, had been the scene of intense fighting in the war's final months. The young men of the region who refused to surrender to the Soviets had gone into the forests, the Mezhbrali, as we described earlier. Some of them came through her family's home. All the boys from Kurtzume who did not raise the white flag, Lydia has said in interviews, ran to the forest. Our house was full of them. Could you really drive your own people away? Lydia didn't drive them away. She helped them. She used her nursing training to bring medicines and bandages to the partisans. She treated them in the hospital in Riga, where she worked. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. It was also, in the moral world Lydia inhabited, simply what you did. On the 23rd of November 1946, the knock came at the door. Lydia was 21 years old. She was arrested along with her parents. The partisans she had helped were also arrested. Her father, Andres Lasmanis, was sentenced to 10 years in a labour camp. Her mother received a 3-year suspended sentence. Lydia herself was sentenced to 5 years in the East Ural Corrective Labour Camp, the Vostoralag, in Sverdlovsk Oblast. In that camp, she contracted tuberculosis. She survived it. She came home, but the Soviet state was not finished with Lydia Lasmana. In 1970, she was arrested a second time. this time for distributing samizdat, the underground self-published literature of Soviet descent, banned books, forbidden ideas. She was sentenced again. She survived that too. And in 1983, during the repression campaigns of the Andropov era, when the Soviet regime launched a new crackdown on Baltic dissidents, Lydia was arrested for the third time and charged with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. She was sentenced to 5 years in a labour camp, followed by 3 years of internal exile in the Altai region of Siberia. In total, Lydia Doronina Lasmana, she took the name Doronina from her husband, spent 14 years in Soviet prisons and forced labour camps. 14 of her birthdays behind bars. She was released in January 1987 as Gorbachev's perestroika began to loosen the grip of the Soviet system. She returned to Latvia, and Latvia regained its independence 4 years later. Today, Lydia lives in a small rented apartment near Brivibas Iela, Freedom Street, in Riga. As of 2025, she is 100 years old. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018, although the prize was ultimately awarded to Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad for their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict. She has grandchildren. Her biographer writes that she rejoices in God, in the freedom that her beloved Latvia has regained, and in her many grandchildren. In 2025, a book about her life was published, written by the Latvian author Inga Ābele, and is now available in English. It's called Lydia's Little Flowers, Lydia's Ziedini in Latvian. It is a collection of Lydia's memories, reflections, and the fragments of beauty she found even in the darkest places. Her story is described as a poignant collection of memories and reflections of a remarkable woman who has become a distinctive symbol of resistance against brutal oppression and the belief in the positive in human nature. You can buy it at the Museum of the Occupation of Latvia for €12. I highly recommend it. Lydia says her mission is to live and bear witness, like a glorious sunset that tells the story of the preceding day. I find that sentence so beautiful, as someone who often watches the sun go down. Where to learn more and how Latvia remembers. If you want to understand the deportations in depth, Riga is one of the best places to do so. Latvia has not concealed this history, it has built memory into the city itself. Start at the Museum of the Occupation of Latvia at Latviešu Strelnieku laukums 1, right in the heart of the old town. The building itself is a striking example of late Soviet architecture, originally designed as a museum for the Red Latvian Riflemen. After independence, it was repurposed, in one of the history's neater ironies, to tell the story of what Soviet occupation meant for the people who lived through it. The museum was established in 1993, and after 10 years of renovation, a completely new permanent exhibition opened on the 1st of June 2022. The new exhibition covers 11 chapters of Latvia's 20th century history, from the interwar republic through to re-independence. It uses modern technology, personal testimonies, photographs, original documents, and artifacts to bring you as close as is possible to what it felt like to be Latvian in these decades. There is a replica of a deportation wagon inside the museum. You can step inside it. When you do, I challenge you to imagine 40 people in that space. The museum is open every day. But before you go to the museum, or after, it doesn't matter, take the train across the Daugava to Tornakauns, the first stop. The memorial at Tornakauns railway station is one of the most moving places in Riga, precisely because it isn't grand. The old Tornakauns station is quiet now. There are no long-distance trains here, no crowds. But walk just 10 metres south of the station and you'll find the wagon. It's a reddish-brown wooden freight car, the kind you might see rusting on a siding anywhere in Eastern Europe. It sits on a short length of track laid specifically for this purpose. Steps lead up to its door. Next to it, a small white panel in Latvian, English and Russian tells you that in June 1941, the Soviet communists deported approximately 15,000 Latvians to distant parts of the Soviet Union in a wagon like this. The wagon was restored using historical photographs and in 1996 placed here by the Occupation Museum in cooperation with Latvian Railways. It has weathered since then, and there have been ongoing concerns about its condition, yet it remains stubbornly in place. A memorial stone in front of the wagon lists the headline figures. 15,424 Latvians were deported on the 14th of June 1941 and 42,125 on the 25th of March 1949. As you might expect, candles are lit in front of the memorial. Stand there for a few minutes. Listen to the trains passing by. You'll understand why this place was chosen. How Latvia commemorates the deportations today. Latvia has made the 14th of June an official national day, the commemoration day of victims of communist terror. Every year on the 14th of June, a wreath-laying ceremony and the laying of flowers takes place at the historical Tactile Memorial, a wall dedicated to the victims of the Soviet occupation at Latviešu Strelnieku laukums, right outside the Occupation Museum. Senior state officials, members of the diplomatic corps, and of course ordinary Latvians attend. The Latvian Association of the Politically Repressed, the organisation of survivors and their descendants, holds an annual march from the Occupation Museum to the Freedom Monument, accompanied by a men's folk group. It was at the Freedom Monument, incidentally, that Latvians first dared to gather publicly to commemorate the deportations in 1987, while the country was still under Soviet occupation. It was an act of collective courage in the age of glasnost, when the old certainties of the Soviet system were just beginning to crack. The 25th of March, the anniversary of the 1949 Operation Priboj deportations, is also observed in Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania as a day of mourning. These commemorations are not merely rituals. They are living acts of remembrance. In a country occupied for 50 years, an occupation the occupier even denies, the act of remembering publicly and defiantly is itself a form of resistance. Back to Tornakauns. that wooden wagon at Tornakaln station. Let me bring you back to it to end. When I went to see it, I stood there for quite a long time. I took some photographs and video. It's not a large space. 40 people in a cattle wagon, weeks on the rails, little food, little water, barely any light, and through every crack in those wooden walls, Latvia disappearing behind them. The Soviet Union that compiled those lists, issued those decrees, and loaded those trains is long gone. The KGB headquarters on Stura Maya, the corner house, is now a museum as well. The people who signed the orders are long dead. But the people who are on those trains, some of them are still alive. Lydia Doranina Lasmana is 100 years old, and she lives on Brivibas Iela, Freedom Street. To me, that is the whole story of Latvia in one address. If you're in Riga, head to Tornakalns, visit the Occupation Museum. Pick up a copy of Lydia's Little Flowers from the museum shop and read it. And if you want to understand why Latvians are the way they are, resilient, fiercely proud of their language and their culture, with a profound instinct for the value of freedom, stand in front of that wagon and stay there until you understand. Paldies. Thank you for listening.